standing in my late grandmother's living room, watching my cousins divide her jewelry like vultures. I listened to Uncle Robert call me the useless one for the 100th time. My Aunt Sarah nodded, saying I had never contributed anything meaningful to this family. They were discussing who deserved to inherit grandmother's house, completely unaware that I had quietly purchased it from her 3 years ago. As they planned their futures in my property, I smiled and decided it was time for some long overdue family education. But before I share how I turned their greed into the most satisfying family justice story you have ever heard, I need to know where my amazing viewers are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. Smash that like button if you are ready for some serious family karma, and make sure you subscribe, because this revenge story has more twists than a soap opera. Trust me, you will want to see how this entitled family gets exactly what they deserve. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I have been the black sheep of the Williams family for as long as I can remember. Growing up, my relatives constantly reminded me that I was different, that I did not belong, that I would never amount to anything. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the only person who believed in me, who saw my potential when everyone else saw failure. After graduating college with a business degree that my family mocked as worthless, I moved across the country and built a successful consulting firm. While my cousins were posting their party pictures on social media and bouncing between jobs, I was quietly building wealth and establishing myself professionally. I rarely visited home, partly because of the distance, but mostly because every family gathering became an opportunity for my relatives to remind me of my supposed inadequacies. 3 years ago, Grandmother Eleanor called me with heartbreaking news. She was struggling financially and feared losing her house to medical bills and property taxes. The house had been in our family for 60 years, and the thought of strangers owning it devastated her. Without hesitation, I made her an offer I would purchase the house from her for fair market value, allowing her to stay there rent-free for the rest of her life. She could maintain her independence and dignity while having the financial security she needed. The transaction was handled quietly through my attorney. We kept the ownership transfer private because Grandmother Eleanor was embarrassed about her financial struggles. She made me promise not to tell the family about our arrangement, fearing they would judge her for selling out to the granddaughter they had always dismissed. I respected her wishes completely, even when it meant enduring more criticism about my supposed lack of family loyalty. During those 3 years, I secretly paid for the house maintenance, property taxes, and even some of Grandmother Eleanor's medical expenses. When the roof needed repairs, I arranged for contractors. When the heating system failed, I had it replaced immediately. My family saw these improvements happening, but assumed Grandmother Eleanor was somehow managing the costs herself, probably through assistance programs they never bothered to research or offer to help with themselves. Meanwhile, my cousins Michael and Patricia were living completely different lives. Michael had dropped out of college twice and was working part-time jobs while spending most of his time gaming and complaining about his lack of opportunities. Patricia had married young, divorced messily, and was constantly asking family members for money to support her expensive lifestyle. Uncle Robert, their father, was a middle manager who had spent decades criticizing everyone else's choices while making questionable financial decisions himself. Aunt Sarah, Patricia's mother, and my mother's sister, had always resented my mother's success and took every opportunity to diminish my achievements. The family dynamics were toxic, built on decades of comparison, jealousy, and misplaced priorities. They measured worth by superficial standards and conventional paths, completely dismissing alternative definitions of success. When I chose entrepreneurship over traditional employment, when I prioritized financial independence over family proximity, when I focused on building something meaningful rather than maintaining appearances, they interpreted these choices as failures and character flaws. Their attitude toward Grandmother Eleanor revealed their true nature. Despite benefiting from her generosity over the years, Despite receiving countless family dinners, holiday gifts, and emotional support, they rarely visited her and never offered substantial help with her mounting expenses. They loved the idea of inheriting her house, but showed little interest in ensuring she could actually afford to maintain it while alive. The irony was devastating. While they criticized my distance from the family, I was the one actually supporting our matriarch. While they questioned my values and priorities, I was the one ensuring grandmother Eleanor could live her final years with dignity and security. While they assumed I had abandoned family responsibility, I was quietly fulfilling it in ways they could not imagine. 3 months ago, grandmother Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral brought our scattered family together for the first time in years, and I immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. Suddenly, everyone was very interested in discussing grandmother Eleanor's legacy and what she would have wanted for the family. The conversations quickly shifted from mourning her loss to calculating potential inheritance values. Uncle Robert appointed himself the unofficial family spokesperson, announcing that we needed to handle Eleanor's affairs responsibly and make decisions that honored her memory. He suggested that the house should go to someone who could properly maintain the family legacy, which everyone understood meant someone other than me. Patricia agreed, enthusiastically pointing out that she had children who could benefit from stable housing. Michael nodded along, probably calculating how much his potential share might be worth. The memorial service took place exactly 1 week after the funeral hosted at grandmother Eleanor's house, because Uncle Robert declared it would be meaningful to gather in her space one final time before making necessary arrangements. I arrived to find my family members already sorting through her belongings with shocking efficiency and disturbing entitlement. Patricia was photographing jewelry pieces and researching their potential value on her phone. Michael was examining the vintage furniture and discussing which pieces might be worth selling versus keeping. Aunt Sarah was going through the china cabinet, setting aside items she claimed had been promised to her years ago. Uncle Robert was measuring rooms and taking notes, clearly planning some kind of property assessment. The conversations were nauseating. They spoke about grandmother Eleanor's possessions as if they were shopping at an estate sale, debating who deserved what based on arbitrary criteria they invented in real time. Patricia argued that she should receive the jewelry because she was the only one with daughters to pass it down to. Michael claimed the vintage guitar collection because he was the musical one in the family, despite never learning to play. Uncle Robert suggested that valuable items should go to whoever could provide the best care, which coincidentally seemed to mean whoever agreed with his opinions. I watched this display with growing disgust, but I remained silent. I was gathering information, observing their true characters, and preparing for the perfect moment to reveal what I knew. They were so focused on their imaginary windfall that they failed to notice my calm demeanor or question why I seemed unconcerned about missing out on this supposed inheritance opportunity. The conversation reached its lowest point when they began discussing the house itself. Uncle Robert announced that selling it would be the most practical decision because none of them could afford the maintenance costs, and dividing the proceeds would benefit everyone equally. Patricia immediately disagreed, suggesting that she should have the opportunity to purchase it at below market value since she was family. Michael proposed turning it into a rental property managed collectively with profits shared among the relatives. As they debated these scenarios, their true feelings about me became crystal clear. Uncle Robert mentioned that I should not expect an equal share since I had never contributed anything meaningful to this family. Aunt Sarah added that I had abandoned everyone by moving away and focusing on my career instead of maintaining family relationships. Patricia suggested that I had never shown proper respect for family traditions and values. The final straw came when Michael referred to me directly as the useless one, explaining to his girlfriend, who had accompanied him, that I was the family member who never accomplished anything important and had always been a disappointment. He said this while standing in the living room of the house I owned, surrounded by furniture I had helped maintain, completely oblivious to the irony of his statement. That was the moment I decided they had revealed enough of their character. I stood up, slowly, walked to the center of the room, and cleared my throat to get their attention. The casual conversation stopped as they turned to look at me, probably expecting me to finally argue for my share of the inheritance or defend myself against their criticisms. Instead, I smiled calmly and said, "I have something important to tell all of you about this house." Uncle Robert rolled his eyes and replied, "Jessica, we know you probably have opinions about how we should handle Eleanor's estate, but those of us who stayed close to family need to make practical decisions." I nodded thoughtfully and responded, "You are absolutely right that practical decisions need to be made. That is why I want to clarify something that might affect your planning." I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling to pictures I had taken of legal documents 3 years earlier. Holding the screen where everyone could see it, I continued. "This is the deed transfer showing that grandmother Eleanor sold this house to me 3 years ago. I am the legal owner of this property, and I have been paying all the expenses since then." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia stared at the phone screen, trying to process what she was seeing. Michael's girlfriend looked confused, clearly wondering why this revelation seemed so significant. Aunt Sarah's face went pale as she began calculating how much money she had assumed she would receive. Uncle Robert was the first to find his voice. "That is impossible. Eleanor never mentioned selling the house. Why would she sell it to you when she knew the family expected to inherit it?" I put my phone away and explained calmly. "Grandmother Eleanor was struggling with medical bills and property taxes. She contacted me because she knew I was in a position to help. We arranged a private sale that allowed her to maintain her independence while ensuring she had financial security. She asked me to keep the arrangement confidential because she was embarrassed about needing help." Patricia's voice was shaky as she asked, "But what about all the improvements that have been made? The new roof, the updated heating system, the landscaping?" "I paid for all of those," I replied matter-of-factly. "I have been maintaining this property for 3 years while grandmother Eleanor lived here rent-free. Every repair, every upgrade, every tax payment came from my accounts." The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. Not only were they not inheriting a house, but they had just spent the afternoon planning how to divide property that belonged to the person they had been insulting. The jewelry they were cataloging, the furniture they were claiming, the space they were measuring, none of it was theirs to distribute. Michael's face turned red as he stammered, "Why did not you tell us about this arrangement sooner?" I maintained my calm tone and replied, "Grandmother Eleanor specifically requested privacy about our financial arrangement. I respected her wishes, just as I respected her decision to leave her personal belongings to all of you through her will. The house was never part of her estate because she had already sold it." The shift in power dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, they were standing in my property, having insulted me repeatedly, having planned to exclude me from inheritance discussions, having revealed their true opinions about my worth and character. They had called me useless while benefiting from my generosity. They had criticized my family loyalty while I was the one actually supporting our grandmother. Uncle Robert's anger was palpable as he demanded, "What do you intend to do with the house now?" I smiled and replied, "I am still deciding, but I think today's conversations have given me some valuable insights into what grandmother Eleanor would have wanted." The immediate aftermath of my revelation created a fascinating study in human behavior under pressure. Within minutes, the same relatives who had been dismissing me as worthless were suddenly very interested in rebuilding our relationships and discussing my generous nature and strong family values. Patricia was the first to attempt damage control. She approached me with tears in her eyes, claiming that she had always believed in my success and that any negative comments were just grief talking. She explained that losing grandmother Eleanor had made everyone emotional and irrational, and surely I could understand that families sometimes say things they do not mean during difficult times. Michael took a different approach, trying to bond with me as fellow grandchildren who had special relationships with grandmother Eleanor. He suggested that we were the younger generation who understood each other better than the older relatives, and perhaps we could work together to honor our grandmother's memory. in meaningful ways. His girlfriend, clearly uncomfortable with the dramatic shift in dynamics, quietly excused herself and waited outside. Uncle Robert and Aunt Sarah attempted to assert some kind of elder authority, suggesting that family decisions should be made collectively, regardless of legal ownership. Uncle Robert pointed out that Grandmother Eleanor had obviously intended for the house to benefit everyone, and my ownership was simply a technical arrangement to help with her financial planning. Aunt Sarah added that surely I would want to honor the spirit of Grandmother Eleanor's wishes rather than focusing on legal technicalities. Their rapid change in attitude would have been amusing if it were not so transparent and insulting. These were the same people who had spent hours discussing my inadequacies and planning how to exclude me from family inheritance. Now they were trying to rewrite history and manipulate me into sharing property they had no claim to. But their reactions also revealed something more interesting. They were genuinely shocked that I had been financially capable of purchasing the house. Despite my college education, my successful business, and my financial independence, they had convinced themselves that I was struggling and unsuccessful. Their surprise at my revelation exposed how completely they had misunderstood my life and achievements. This disconnect gave me a significant strategic advantage. While they were scrambling to process new information and recalibrate their approach, I was operating with complete clarity about my situation and objectives. I had spent years building my business, establishing financial security, and developing professional networks. I had legal ownership of the property, complete documentation of my financial contributions, and the moral authority that came from actually supporting Grandmother Eleanor when she needed help. Over the following days, I received numerous calls and messages from family members seeking private conversations. Each relative tried different persuasion tactics, offering various forms of cooperation in exchange for favorable treatment regarding the house. These conversations revealed the depth of their financial desperation and the extent of their previous assumptions about inheriting property. Patricia called crying, explaining that she had been counting on inheritance money to help with her children's education expenses. She had apparently borrowed against her expected inheritance and was now facing serious financial difficulties. She begged me to consider selling the house and sharing the proceeds, emphasizing how much Grandmother Eleanor had loved her great-grandchildren. Michael sent long text messages detailing his plans to start a music production business and how Grandmother Eleanor had always encouraged his creative pursuits. He suggested that she would have wanted her house sale proceeds to fund his artistic development, and perhaps we could arrange some kind of payment plan that would help him achieve his dreams while giving me a return on my investment. Uncle Robert attempted a more authoritative approach, reminding me of family loyalty obligations and suggesting that my success came partly from family support over the years. He argued that Grandmother Eleanor had raised me with values that should guide my decisions now, and those values emphasized sharing and caring for family members in need. Aunt Sarah tried emotional manipulation, describing how disappointed and hurt Grandmother Eleanor would be to see family fighting over money and property. She suggested that my decision about the house would define my character and determine how I would be remembered by future generations of our family. These conversations were revealing and strategically useful. Each relative was inadvertently providing me with detailed information about their financial situations, their assumptions about family obligations, and their willingness to pressure me for personal benefit. They were also demonstrating exactly the attitudes and behaviors that had made our family dynamics so toxic for years. But the most interesting development came from an unexpected source. My cousin, David Uncle Robert's younger brother, who lived in another state, contacted me after hearing about the situation through family gossip networks. David had always been somewhat distant from the main family drama, partly because of geography, and partly because of personality differences. David's perspective was completely different from the other relatives. He congratulated me on my success and my thoughtful support of Grandmother Eleanor during her final years. He shared his own frustrations with family dynamics and revealed information that I had never known about our relatives' financial behaviors and attitudes. According to David, Uncle Robert had borrowed money from Grandmother Eleanor multiple times over the years and had never repaid most of it. Patricia had repeatedly asked for financial help with various crises, many of which were caused by poor financial planning and overspending. Michael had lived rent-free in grandmother Eleanor's basement for 6 months after his second college dropout, contributing nothing to household expenses. David also revealed that several family members had been discussing grandmother Eleanor's potential inheritance for years, making plans and assumptions about property distribution long before her death. They had apparently calculated expected values and discussed how to handle the logistics of selling or dividing assets. My exclusion from these conversations had been deliberate and systematic. This information transformed my understanding of the situation completely. My relatives had not simply made insensitive comments during a grief-stricken moment. They had been planning to exclude me from inheritance discussions for years while simultaneously benefiting from my financial support of grandmother Eleanor. They had systematically taken advantage of our grandmother's generosity while planning to profit from her death. David proposed an alliance based on mutual interest in family accountability and justice. He had his own grievances against Uncle Robert's controlling behavior and Patricia's entitled attitudes. He suggested that we could work together to ensure that family truth-telling happened and appropriate consequences were delivered for years of manipulation and exploitation. The alliance with David provided me with several strategic advantages. He had insider knowledge about family financial arrangements and historical grievances. He had credibility with some family members who might dismiss my perspective as biased or vindictive. He also had his own motivations for wanting accountability, which meant our cooperation was based on mutual benefit rather than charity. Together, we began planning a comprehensive response that would address not just the house ownership revelation, but the broader patterns of family manipulation and exploitation that had created the current crisis. David provided historical documentation of financial arrangements, and I contributed legal evidence and documentation of my support for grandmother Eleanor. We realized that this situation was bigger than just inheritance disputes or property ownership. This was an opportunity to expose and address years of family dysfunction, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse. The memorial service confrontation had simply been the catalyst that brought underlying problems to the surface. Our planning sessions revealed the extent of damage that had been done to family relationships through years of favoritism, manipulation, and exploitation. Grandmother Eleanor had been supporting multiple family members financially while being pressured to make inheritance promises to others. Various relatives had been competing for her favor and resources while criticizing those who were actually providing substantial help. The house ownership revelation had exposed these dynamics, but it had also created an opportunity to reset family relationships based on truth, accountability, and genuine mutual respect rather than manipulation and exploitation. Our alliance with David seemed to be progressing perfectly, until I discovered his true motivations during what I thought was a routine planning conversation. We had been working together for 2 weeks documenting family financial arrangements and preparing a comprehensive presentation that would expose years of manipulation and exploitation. David had been enthusiastic, helpful, and seemingly committed to family accountability and justice. The betrayal came during a phone call, where David thought I had hung up, but the line remained connected due to a technical glitch. I heard him immediately dial another number and begin speaking to Uncle Robert in a completely different tone than he had ever used with me. The conversation I overheard revealed that David had been feeding Uncle Robert detailed information about my plans, my evidence, and my emotional state throughout our entire supposed alliance. "She has copies of all the loan documents," David was explaining. "She knows about the 6 months Michael lived rent-free, and she has bank records showing the mortgage payments. But here's the important part. She is planning to present everything at the family gathering next weekend. If we can discredit her evidence beforehand, we can control the narrative." My heart sank as I realized the scope of his deception. David was not seeking justice or accountability. He was positioning himself as a double agent to gain favor with Uncle Robert and potentially share in whatever benefits they could extract from the situation. His insider information about my plans had made him valuable to the relatives who were scrambling to minimize their exposure and maintain their victim narrative. The conversation continued with David providing detailed intelligence about my emotional vulnerabilities and strategic concerns. He told Uncle Robert that I was desperate for family acceptance and could probably be manipulated through guilt about Grandmother Eleanor's wishes. He suggested that if they presented a united front and accused me of tearing the family apart over money, I might back down to preserve relationships. Even worse, David revealed that he had been secretly recording our conversations and had copies of documents I had shared with him in confidence. He was planning to use this information to construct an alternative narrative where I was the one taking advantage of Grandmother Eleanor's financial desperation, and the family was simply trying to protect her legacy from exploitation. The betrayal was devastating on multiple levels. I had trusted David because he seemed different from the other relatives, because he had appeared to share my frustrations with family dysfunction, and because his geographical distance suggested he was less invested in the inheritance disputes. His willingness to listen and collaborate had felt like validation that not everyone in our family was selfish and manipulative. But David's deception was actually more calculated and cruel than the other relatives' obvious greed. While Uncle Robert, Patricia Michael, and Aunt Sarah had been transparent about their self-interest and entitlement, David had pretended to care about justice and accountability while secretly working to undermine me. He had exploited my desire for family connection and my hope that someone in our family shared my values. The immediate practical consequences were serious. David knew about my evidence, my emotional triggers, and my planned timeline for revealing family financial abuse. He could help the other relatives prepare counter-arguments, alternative explanations, and emotional manipulation tactics. He had copies of sensitive documents that could be taken out of context or misrepresented. He had recordings of private conversations where I had expressed doubts, frustrations, and vulnerabilities. But the emotional impact was even more damaging. David's betrayal confirmed my worst fears about our family dynamics and suggested that perhaps I really was naive to hope for authentic relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. If someone who seemed supportive and principled could secretly be working against me, how could I trust my judgment about anyone else's motivations? The betrayal also forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about my own behavior and expectations. Had I been too quick to trust David because I was desperate for an ally? Had I shared too much information too quickly because I wanted validation that my perspective was reasonable? Had I been manipulated into revealing strategic information because I was emotionally vulnerable after years of family rejection? Over the next few days, I watched David continue his performance as my trusted ally while knowing he was simultaneously reporting to Uncle Robert. The experience was surreal and educational, showing me exactly how sophisticated family manipulation could become when someone was willing to engage in long-term deception for personal benefit. David's betrayal also revealed additional information about the other relatives' strategies and capabilities. The fact that Uncle Robert had been able to recruit David as a double agent suggested more organizational sophistication than I had credited him with. Their willingness to engage in recording conversations and document theft indicated they were prepared to use potentially illegal tactics to protect their interests. But perhaps most importantly, David's betrayal forced me to develop emotional resilience and strategic independence that I had not possessed before. I could no longer rely on family connections or trust family members based on superficial similarities or apparent shared values. I had to evaluate everyone's actions rather than their words, and I had to prepare for the possibility that anyone might prioritize personal benefit over family loyalty or basic honesty. The weekend family gathering that David had mentioned became a crucial deadline. I now knew that Uncle Robert and his allies were expecting me to present my evidence so they could implement their counter-strategy. They were probably planning to overwhelm me with emotional manipulation, alternative narratives, and coordinated pressure designed to make me back down or compromise. Instead of walking into their trap, I decided to change my timeline and my approach completely. If they wanted to play sophisticated games with recording document theft and double agents, I would demonstrate that I could adapt and respond strategically, rather than just reacting emotionally to their provocations. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also been educational. I now understood the true nature of my family's dysfunction and the lengths they would go to protect their interests and maintain their victim narratives. David's deception had actually provided me with valuable intelligence about their capabilities, their strategies, and their expectations. Most importantly, the betrayal had forced me to develop authentic independence and emotional resilience. I could no longer hope that family connections would provide the support and validation I craved. I had to build strength and strategic thinking based on my own values and capabilities, rather than seeking approval or alliance from people who had repeatedly demonstrated their willingness to prioritize personal benefit over honesty and mutual respect. The morning after discovering David's betrayal, I received an unexpected phone call that would completely transform my situation and provide the alliance I actually needed. Margaret Thompson, grandmother Eleanor's longtime neighbor and closest friend, contacted me with information that changed everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years. Margaret explained that grandmother Eleanor had confided in her about far more than just our private real estate arrangement. She had detailed documentation of every family member's financial requests, promises made and broken, and manipulative behaviors that had caused her significant emotional distress during her final years. Margaret had been keeping this information private out of respect for Eleanor's wishes, but recent family behavior had convinced her that the truth needed to be revealed. "Your grandmother was heartbroken about how your family treated you," Margaret told me during our first conversation. "She used to sit on her porch and tell me stories about your phone calls, your business success, your thoughtfulness. She was so proud of you, but she was also furious that everyone else dismissed your achievements and criticized your character." Margaret had been Eleanor's confidant for over 15 years, and she possessed detailed knowledge about family dynamics that none of us realized she had observed and documented. As Eleanor's closest friend and neighbor, she had witnessed countless family visits, overheard numerous conversations, and received regular updates about each relative's behavior and treatment of Eleanor. The documentation Margaret shared was comprehensive and devastating. She had copies of emails where Patricia had pressured Eleanor for money, while simultaneously complaining about Eleanor's outdated values and unrealistic expectations about family loyalty. She had written records of conversations where Michael had promised to visit regularly in exchange for financial support, then disappeared for months without contact. She had detailed accounts of Uncle Robert's attempts to pressure Eleanor into changing her will to favor his children over other relatives. Most damaging were the recordings Margaret had made during the final year of Eleanor's life. With Eleanor's permission, Margaret had documented several family conversations where relatives had openly discussed their inheritance expectations, their plans for Eleanor's property, and their dismissive attitudes toward family members they considered unsuccessful or unworthy. These recordings included a particularly cruel conversation where Patricia and Michael had calculated the potential value of Eleanor's estate and discussed strategies for excluding me from inheritance discussions. They had laughed about my pathetic career choices and agreed that I probably could not afford to contest any family decisions about property distribution. They had also discussed ways to pressure Eleanor into making specific bequests while she was emotionally vulnerable after medical procedures. But Margaret's most valuable contribution was her perspective as an outsider who had observed our family dysfunction with clarity and objectivity. She could identify patterns of manipulation and emotional abuse that we had normalized through years of exposure. She could articulate the impact of family behavior on Eleanor's emotional well-being during her final years. She could provide independent validation of my perspective and evidence that contradicted the alternative narratives my relatives were preparing. Margaret's alliance was motivated by genuine affection for Eleanor and outrage about how the family was handling her memory and legacy. Unlike David, whose motivations had been self-serving and deceptive, Margaret was driven by loyalty to Eleanor and commitment to ensuring that truth prevailed over manipulation and exploitation. Her credibility was unquestionable because she had no financial interest in inheritance disputes and no family relationships that could bias her perspective. Working with Margaret, I began preparing a comprehensive presentation that would expose the full scope of family dysfunction and provide indisputable evidence of each relative's actual behavior during Eleanor's final years. We had documentation showing that Uncle Robert had borrowed over $15,000 from Eleanor and repaid less than half of it. We had evidence that Patricia had repeatedly demanded financial help while contributing nothing to Eleanor's care or support. We had proof that Michael had lived rent-free in Eleanor's house for months, while Eleanor struggled with medical bills and property maintenance costs. Margaret also provided crucial strategic advice based on her decades of experience managing community organizations and resolving interpersonal conflicts. She suggested that instead of confronting the family directly about their behavior, we should focus on honoring Eleanor's actual wishes and values, rather than the imaginary legacy they were trying to construct for their own benefit. Eleanor wanted accountability and honesty, Margaret explained. She was tired of people taking advantage of her generosity while criticizing her judgment and dismissing her feelings. The best way to honor her memory is to ensure that truth prevails over manipulation and that consequences are appropriate for everyone's actual behavior. Margaret's approach was more sophisticated and sustainable than the emotional confrontation I had been planning. Instead of trying to shame my relatives into better behavior, we would document their actions and allow natural consequences to follow. Instead of seeking revenge or punishment, we would ensure that accurate information was available for anyone who wanted to make informed decisions about relationships and trust. The evidence we compiled together was overwhelmingly comprehensive. Bank records showed my consistent financial support of Eleanor alongside detailed documentation of other relatives' requests and defaults. Communication records revealed the manipulative language and emotional pressure tactics various family members had used. Independent witness accounts from Margaret provided objective validation of subjective experiences and impressions. But perhaps most powerful was the context Margaret provided about Eleanor's emotional state during her final years. She revealed that Eleanor had been deeply hurt by family attitudes toward me and had spent considerable time discussing her frustration with relatives who seemed to value inheritance potential over authentic relationships. Eleanor had been proud of my independence and success, but heartbroken that the family dismissed my achievements and questioned my character. She used to say that you were the only one who treated her like a person rather than a source of inheritance, Margaret shared. Everyone else seemed to be managing their relationships with her based on what they expected to receive when she died. You were the only one who helped her because you cared about her well-being. This information transformed my understanding of Eleanor's perspective and motivations. I had assumed that our private real estate arrangement was primarily about her financial needs, but Margaret revealed that it had also been Eleanor's way of ensuring that someone who genuinely cared about her would have control over her beloved house after her death. The secrecy had not just been about avoiding family judgment, it had been about protecting her decision from family pressure and manipulation. Margaret's alliance provided me with emotional validation, strategic expertise, and irrefutable evidence. But more importantly, it connected me with Eleanor's authentic values and wishes rather than the distorted legacy narrative my relatives were trying to construct. I was no longer fighting just for property rights or personal vindication. I was honoring Eleanor's actual values and ensuring that her true legacy prevailed over family manipulation and exploitation. Working with Margaret, I felt confident and prepared rather than defensive and reactive. We had comprehensive documentation, independent validation, and clear strategic objectives. We were ready to present truth and allow appropriate consequences to follow naturally rather than seeking emotional confrontation or personal revenge. The family gathering that Uncle Robert had been planning became the setting for the most comprehensive truth-telling session our family had ever experienced. But instead of walking into their prepared ambush, I arrived with Margaret and a complete presentation that systematically exposed 3 years of financial manipulation, emotional abuse, and coordinated deception. I began by thanking everyone for gathering to honor Eleanor's memory and announced that Margaret had asked to share some insights about Eleanor's final years that would help us understand her true wishes and values. The shift in dynamics was immediate when Margaret introduced herself as Eleanor's closest friend and confidant who had been documenting family interactions for the past several years. Margaret's presentation was methodical and devastating. She began with audio recordings of family members discussing inheritance calculations and strategies for excluding me from family decisions. Patricia's voice was clearly audible, laughing about my pathetic career and suggesting that I would be too poor to fight any family decisions about property distribution. Michael's voice was equally clear, discussing how to pressure Eleanor into making specific bequests while she was vulnerable after medical procedures. Uncle Robert's attempts to interrupt and discredit Margaret were futile because she had years of documented evidence and independent credibility. When he suggested that private conversations were being taken out of context, Margaret played longer recordings that showed the full context of his children's manipulation tactics and his own pressure campaigns designed to influence Eleanor's financial decisions. The documentation of financial arrangements was equally comprehensive. Margaret presented bank records showing that Uncle Robert had borrowed $15,400 from Eleanor over 2 years and had repaid only $4,000. Patricia had requested financial assistance 11 times for various emergencies, receiving over $8,000 total while contributing nothing to Eleanor's care or household maintenance. Michael had lived rent-free in Eleanor's basement for 6 months, consuming household resources worth approximately $3,000, while Eleanor struggled with medical bills. In contrast, the records showed my consistent financial support totaling over $47,000 in property purchases, maintenance taxes, and medical assistance. While other relatives were extracting resources from Eleanor and planning to inherit her property, I had been the one actually supporting her independence and security during her final years. The revelation about David's betrayal became a powerful demonstration of family manipulation tactics. Margaret had suspected David's duplicity and had recorded his conversation with Uncle Robert about using my private information to discredit my evidence. Playing this recording for the entire family exposed not just David's deception, but Uncle Robert's willingness to coordinate sophisticated manipulation campaigns against family members. The immediate consequences were swift and decisive. Patricia broke down crying when she realized that her recorded conversations about inheritance planning would become public knowledge, potentially affecting her custody arrangements and social relationships. Michael's girlfriend, who had returned for this gathering, quietly left again after hearing the recordings of his manipulative behavior and financial exploitation of an elderly relative. Uncle Robert's authority and credibility collapsed completely when the recordings revealed his coordination of pressure tactics and manipulation campaigns. His attempts to maintain control of the family narrative became impossible when faced with indisputable audio evidence of his own words and strategic planning sessions. But the most satisfying consequence was David's complete exposure as a family manipulator who had exploited both sides of a family conflict for personal benefit. His reputation for trustworthiness and integrity was destroyed when everyone heard the recordings of his double-agent activities and his willingness to betray confidential information for strategic advantage. The financial consequences were also immediate. I announced that I would be pursuing legal action to recover the unpaid loans Eleanor had made to various family members since those debts had transferred to her estate and then to me as the beneficiary of her remaining assets. I would also be charging fair market rent for any family members who wanted to continue using Eleanor's house for gatherings or storage. More importantly, I established clear boundaries about future family relationships. Anyone who wanted to maintain a relationship with me would need to demonstrate respect for honesty, accountability, and mutual support rather than manipulation and exploitation. I would no longer tolerate criticism about my life choices from people who had taken advantage of our grandmother's generosity while contributing nothing to her actual well-being. The transformation in family dynamics was immediate and permanent. Patricia and Michael lost their sense of entitlement and superiority when confronted with evidence of their actual behavior and contributions. Uncle Robert's controlling influence disappeared when his manipulation tactics were exposed, and his credibility was destroyed. David became a family pariah when everyone realized the extent of his deceptive and opportunistic behavior. But the most meaningful outcome was my connection with Margaret, who became the authentic family relationship I had always hoped to find. Margaret's loyalty to Eleanor's memory, her commitment to truth and accountability, and her genuine care for my well-being provided the supportive relationship I had been seeking from relatives who were incapable of authentic connection. Margaret and I developed a chosen family relationship based on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. She became a mentor confidant and surrogate grandmother, who helped me process the grief of losing Eleanor while celebrating the strength and independence Eleanor had always encouraged me to develop. The house became a sanctuary where Margaret and I could honor Eleanor's memory through authentic appreciation rather than inheritance disputes and manipulation. We maintained Eleanor's garden, preserved her favorite spaces, and created new traditions that reflected her values of generosity, honesty, and genuine family loyalty. My business continued thriving partly because the experience of confronting family manipulation had strengthened my confidence and strategic thinking abilities. I learned to trust my own judgment, establish clear boundaries, and build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than family obligation or social expectation. The extended consequences for my relatives were appropriate and educational. Patricia's financial difficulties continued because she had to confront her spending patterns and manipulation tactics rather than expecting inheritance windfalls to solve her problems. Michael was forced to develop genuine independence and responsibility, rather than relying on family resources and emotional manipulation. Uncle Robert lost his controlling influence over family decisions and had to rebuild relationships based on honesty rather than authority and intimidation. Most importantly, I realized that authentic family relationships are based on choice, mutual respect, and shared values rather than genetic connections or social obligations. Margaret became more of a grandmother to me than my actual relatives had ever been, and our chosen family provided the emotional support and authentic connection I had always deserved. The experience taught me that justice is not about revenge or punishment, but about truth, accountability, and appropriate consequences that allow everyone to make informed decisions about relationships and trust. Eleanor's legacy lived on through my commitment to honesty, generosity, and authentic connection rather than manipulation and exploitation. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own choices while building authentic relationships with people who share your values and genuinely care about your well-being. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that completely changed your perspective on relationships and loyalty? What was your most satisfying moment when family karma finally caught up with someone who had taken advantage of your kindness? I would love to hear your stories about chosen family and how you dealt with relatives who prioritized inheritance over authentic relationships. Drop your experiences in the comments below, and let me know if you think I handled this situation appropriately, or if you would have done something different. If this story resonated with your own family drama experiences, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life justice stories that prove karma eventually catches up with everyone. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself and honoring genuine family values is always worth it, even when it means confronting difficult truths about the people you thought you could trust. Thank you for listening to my family revenge story, And remember that authentic relationships built on mutual respect and shared values are always more valuable than family connections based on manipulation and obligation. May you find the courage to seek truth, establish healthy boundaries, and build chosen family relationships that truly honor your worth and values.